Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. In order to accommodate anyone having difficulty with their audio or their video, or for those still attempting to log in, we will begin the presentation in 2 minutes, at which point it will be 32 minutes after the hour. Again, we will begin the presentation at 32 minutes after the hour, which is about 1 minute and 40 seconds from now. Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you just joining us, in order to accommodate those having any difficulty with audio or video, we will begin the presentation in approximately 1 minute. You can always tell someone who's involved in production, because when you tell them they have to sit in place for a minute and wait, and the time is totally wasted to them, they get a little annoyed. And you can see Eric, he's sort of, you know,
Yeah.
What do I have to wait for a minute for?
That's right.
Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you just joining us, we will begin the presentation in approximately 30 seconds. Ladies and gentlemen, the presentation will begin momentarily. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Coding for Cultural Heritage, Part 2, Advanced Case Studies. Before we begin today's presentation with today's guest presenter, I'd like to situate ourselves inside of the 5-part series that we are executing. On Tuesday of this week, 2 days ago, we did Part 1, Coding for Cultural Heritage, a call to community action, in which we discussed what coding is, what coding can do well, and we called to action the community to join us in doing open source coding to promote efficiency for all. Today's presentation is coding as an advanced set of case studies. If Tuesday's presentation was basically asking you or informing you that it's a really great idea to bake bread at home, that homemade bread tastes delicious, well then today, Part 2 is an interview with a person who owns a professional bakery who makes bread in large quantity every day. That is, we were talking about the efficiency of coding, and today we'll be looking at how far that can go. In parts 3, 4, and 5 of this series, we will do a step-by-step instruction of 3 major languages and methodologies to program for cultural heritage: AppleScript, Python, and the Capture One SDK. In each of those sessions, we'll begin from the very beginning, which is a great place to begin. We'll install the required applications. We'll tell you how to start the actual script or code. We'll teach you enough about code in the course of that part, be able to create an actual usable, if relatively simple, application or utility. And then after these online presentations, we'll be doing a capstone class in person. These will go much deeper. There'll be much more content, much longer, and they'll take place over the course of 2 days with somewhere around 10 hours of instruction on those 2 days. While the first 5 parts here are all going to be free and online and available to all, the in-person class, the 2-day class that results in certification, will be a paid class. It will end in a test that you then need to pass in order to become certified. Lastly, before I turn it over to Eric, I'd like to mention that the first 2 presentations in the series are especially oriented towards cultural heritage. That is, museums, libraries, archives, and art reproduction. If you're not part of that world, if you're more on the commercial vendor side doing digital teching or photography in the context of, for example, an e-commerce studio, you may find that there are similarities and still something of interest to be had from these 2 parts, but they are certainly oriented more towards cultural heritage than to commercial applications. Parts 3, 4, and 5, as well as the capstone, will all be sort of equal opportunity in use case and will be helpful to you regardless of how you use imaging and Capture One and digital image workflow. So today's presenters include me, mostly to introduce Eric and to play the role of moderator and MC. and also Eric, who I will encourage to introduce himself while I am off video. Just a quick few logistical notes before I ask him to introduce and we continue. If you have not already, you can join the chat on the right side of your screen. Should be that way. That chat is being moderated by Arnab Chatterjee of Digital Transitions. So if you ask a question, you may not have it answered right away, but Arnab will be flagging that question so we can address it at the end of this presentation, which we expect to take roughly half an hour, depending on what sidebars and off-topic conversations come up. That should cover our logistics. If you are having difficulty with the video or audio, you can reach out in the chat. And if you are having significant quality issues with the video, you are encouraged to look at the handout sections where there's a PDF of the slide deck, which may be easier for you to see in full quality. So without further ado, Eric.
Thank you very much, Doug. Very much appreciated. My name is Eric Philcox, and I am the owner and founder of Pixel Acuity and co-owner of Digital Transitions. As you may know, we've merged with Digital Transitions late last year, and we are very excited about the possibilities that brings. And one of the biggest things that has come up recently is our joint experiences in furthering coding for cultural heritage. My presentation is going to build on the presentation by Doug and Jeremy. They introduced how to get started with coding for cultural heritage, and my presentation will show you what it's like to deploy coding at scale within cultural heritage institutions. But before I begin, I'd like to give a shout out to Doug and Jeremy. They're both very good coders and could very easily have presented on this topic. So first, we want to take a look at Pixelflow, which is a in-house software that we use that we do our coding within. Then we'll look at some case studies that we have deployed at various museums and institutions across the country. And then finally, we'll get into some considerations that you're likely going to need to pay attention to when you are using this type of workflow. So that being said, Pixelflow is not a commercial software product. We built it in-house from the ground up. What we intended it to do is take care of post-processing tasks that we're previously doing manually and taking a great deal of time. You know, as a service bureau, we don't have the luxury of having one workflow and sticking with that. We actually have to adapt to each institution that we work with. And so in that sense, we built Pixelflow to be quite modular and very easily editable. So we can adapt quickly and very nimbly. So the first thing I'll focus on is when we get a project in-house or we get a delivery of materials, whether it be we're going to an institution or they're coming to our offsite imaging studios, we generally get a digital manifest. And what that digital manifest does is take a look at all the materials that we received to digitize. And what we've designed Pixelflow to do is to be able to check that what we got has been digitized, making sure that we didn't forget anything to make sure nothing was skipped over in the digitization process, and potentially to point out some things that were digitized that were not on the manifest. So it's kind of an initial QC process, which we'll get into much more down the road, right down the road in this presentation. Here's an example of a manifest that we might get. You can see that we have a label, and a label number that translates back to a collection ID, and then a recto verso line that we need to input file names on. And as we go through the imaging and post-production process, those file names get added to the spreadsheet. And if you can imagine the size of this particular project, numbers in the millions of captures, and to do this manually would take a great deal of time. So being able to do this programmatically, saves, easily multiple full-time positions, just inputting the files. So the next part that we are actually working with is barcoding. And we're working with a number of projects that have needs for barcoding. This saves a lot of time and effort to, for manual input of file names. That's really what we're using it for, is taking the barcode name and inputting it into the file name. Pixelflow can find that barcode, confirm the value is valid, and rename that barcode, rename the file according to that barcode after the imaging has already taken place. In this particular image, you can see that the matrix style barcode is actually smaller than the B. Pixelflow lets us design the expected number of characters and the type of characters in that barcode as a result of this, and the image quality of our capture systems. In a project where we successfully captured 75,000 Bs over 2 8-week periods, we just had a handful of barcode errors that we had to address. Mostly it resulted from damaged barcodes, which you'd have to, most of the time you just have to replace that barcode. So nothing that the software did wrong or the operators did wrong. It just just had to replace that barcode. Another example of a barcode project is this picture study collection. In this case, almost every item in the collection has been barcoded. However, the barcode is sometimes on the recto, sometimes on the verso, and we have to be able to identify that and name the recto verso in a sequential order, no matter where the barcode is found. It's also worth noting that in cases the barcode value needed to be modified, we can do that as well. In this case, the barcode has an extra digit at the end, and we need to drop that digit in the file name, which is programmatically, possible. It just needs to be identified. Now, as I stated before, the time saving of the barcode of the barcoding process is significant. Imagine an operator with a barcode scanner or manually typing that into the file name of each object before it's captured, resetting the counter, and how much potential error there could be in that process. This takes out the error rate, and it also lets the operator focus solely on capture.
So Eric, in this case, you're actually reading the barcode value from the image that's captured. You're not using a handheld barcode scanner and scanning the actual barcode.
That's correct. So the operator doesn't have to pay attention at all to file naming. They just have a sequential counter. They just continue to capture, and it's a savings of hundreds of thousands of man hours over the course of large-scale projects. Now, of course, what also Pixelflow can do is generate TIFFs and JPEGs. For some collections, smaller in nature, it's perfectly acceptable and reasonable to use Capture One to generate those derivatives. But some of our jobs, we're capturing many thousands of raw files per station per day. And going through and selecting all those files, processing them is time consuming. And if we can automate that process, that's just another point in the workflow that we can save time. We have also designed Pixelflow that it can perform OCR and PDF generations. We found it adds a tremendous amount of value to our clients, and it instantly improves the searchability and description of their assets. By using Pixelflow to incorporate this into the same automated pipeline, we've saved a tremendous amount of time, meaning that while the TIFFs and JPEGs are being processed, the PDFs and OCR process is all happening at the same time. So when you say you photographed 2,000 images that day, you kick off Pixelflow. When you come in the morning, you have TIFFs, JPEGs, OCR PDFs ready to be sent to a client. All right. So what we like to think about this as just the tip of the iceberg as to what we're doing with Pixelflow and OCR. Right now, we are exploring using the Google API for image recognition, and that would be able to identify people, places, and objects in the images that we are processing OCRing. And that can, there's really some exciting things that could potentially come from that. So the next thing that we've set Pixelflow up to do is create Md5 checksums. If for some of you that are not aware of what a checksum is, a checksum is a way that a client can confirm they received every single file we sent them in completion. Depending on how many files you're sending back and forth, that may seem like a fairly trivial task, but the Md5 checksum allows us to validate the process, and it is far more robust against various things that can happen during file transfer. And this is just an example of what a checksum would look like. You have the file name on the right-hand side and the checksum to the left. And when this is generated before the files are transferred to our client, and then after, and then is validated on their end so that they know each file that is in this list is they're getting exactly what we sent them. So one of the more important things that Pixelflow does is it can automatically run a variety of initial file quality control tests. For example, we know we are expecting objects of a certain size. It can flag files that contain crops that are unusually small or unusually large. It can also have a spreadsheet or CSV file that shows how many pages should be in a series of bound materials, so that we can make sure that it was digitized in its completeness. So the next slide is an example of where Pixelflow has caught a potential QC issue. So when you're photographing the same size object as within this collection, we know that the crop should be within 99% similar to the previous crop. You know, we set these captures up in couplings. So if one crop is larger or smaller than the next crop, we know that there's a potential issue. We can flag them within capture one to have a certain color tag. And we can sort by color tag and then go back through and look at each potential issue that Pixelflow finds. In this case, what has happened is that with this image set, you actually see an inline target next to the object itself. That's not how we want to deliver the file. And in this case, the object was placed a little bit too close to the inline target so that the crop is on one frame is bigger than the next. So this allows us to catch those type. This is an example of what the Pixelflow allows us to catch. So the next thing we'll do is we'll take a look at some other considerations of things you want to keep in mind when you're doing this type of coding work. Customizing, Pixelflow in any coding application takes time, and how much time depends on how similar the job is to one we've already previously done. That setup times may mean it's not worth it for all jobs. It's more or less a judgment call. when we're looking at individual projects, and sometimes they're pretty similar to what we've done in the past, but in some cases, there's a significant amount of work that needs to be done to automate these tasks, and sometimes that's not as apparent as you might think. So automating large parts of our post-processing has several effects on our staffing needs as well. First, it means we don't have to staff every job with someone who already knows how to do raw processing. We can focus on resumes that have material handling experience, experience with museum, library objects, knowledge of art and art history, rather than a resume that reads, proficiency at raw processing. It also means that the staff we hire can focus more exclusively on the safe handling of materials. They can invest more time and concentration into the physical parts of the workflow, and since the digital parts of the workflow has been greatly simplified. We generally choose to offload Pixelflow on a separate computer as well, then keep it on the initial capture station. This keeps the delegation of responsibility and the chain of custody of the files very clear, and each capture tech only has to worry about capture, and their computer station is always available to do that task. But that does mean we've had to add a few more computers to our inventory and have a separate workstation just dedicated to these post-production tasks. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. Finally, we've had to adapt our QC process based on the way the code can fail, which is not always as intuitive as you might think. Code faithfully executes exactly what you've asked it to do. So if there's an imperfection in what you've asked it to do, it'll fail pretty consistently. So before the project starts, we generally do a pilot, having more than one person go through the execution of that code, and because we program it to do things like validation with Jove, golden thread validation, and when it comes to finding unexpected issues, generally you want to have more than one person looking into that and going through the process, because there's always some little thing that's missed, both at the beginning of a project and as you progress through a project. Next, we have our code generate very, verbose reports, noting that any time and expectation, noting any time that any expectation hasn't been met. When the code sees an expectation that wasn't met, and it actually creates a report so that the operator can review that report at the end of the post-processing process and then resolve any issues that need to be resolved. Finally, we very heavily emphasize to our team that they are still very personally responsible for the delivered product, and the final results still need human eyes and as part of the QC process. The bottom line is that the automation does not mean that you don't do QC throughout the process. It means the approach to your QC needs to change to accommodate, the new set of processing guidelines. So with that, I think we'll hand it over to some questions.
So Arnab, I believe that you are in the moderation. If anybody attending has questions, they can. Arnab will be flagging those questions for us to answer. And we will start off here with the question I have is primarily work on the PC. If I'm interested in the capstone, would I need to attend the other sessions that use a Mac? Curious how the webinars would work with the capstone. So to be very clear, We expect to have parts 3, 4, and 5 focus almost exclusively on the Mac platform. AppleScript in particular is only available on the Mac platform. So if you're working on PC, I would just skip that entirely unless there's some potential that you might add a Mac to a workflow just to gain the ability to do Apple scripting. So if you're looking at PC, I would just advise you that you will need to have a little bit of your own volition going in, that you find the analog to the things that we're talking about. In most cases, for example, Python and the Capture One SDK, most of it's going to be cross-compatible, and most of it just requires learning which other application is going to be used. But that should give you some idea. We are going to be mostly focused on the Mac platform. Next question, please, Arnab. How many co-owners does DT have now? So I am a co-owner, and Mark and Pete Siegel and Mark Oster are co-owners, and Eric.
Yep.
So there you go. That's all of them. With Pixelflow, were records created ahead of time, or was this done post-capture? So I believe that's going to be a reference to the slide here that you were presenting about reconciling a spreadsheet. So maybe you can speak to how different clients have provided you different kinds of manifests and how you are able to either reconcile or return them to them.
Right. So in this particular case, this example, it was created ahead of time because they already had records for the images that we were digitizing down to the item level. In the cases of, say, some of the natural history collections, they have collection level data, but they don't have item level data. So when we are digitizing, we're actually creating records as we digitize. So it just depends on where they are in the process and what makes sense. You know, the picture study project and some of these other projects, that everything's all very, you know, all the collection is known. There's descriptive metadata. It's already been gone through very thoroughly. Then we generally have a very robust report that we're working from. But in the cases of, you know, collections where it's just, you know, a collection level data, and we're creating those records, generally we generate this report.
So Eric, it would seem like the intuitive shorthand is that if records already exist, you're using them. If they don't, you're creating them. Is there any exception to that? Has there been any client where they have records, but for one reason or another, you are actually replacing those records with your own?
No, I don't think we've ever been a situation.
So basically, if there's records, you use them. If not, you make them.
That's correct.
And again, for anybody who is not yet asked a question or has asked a question and has not yet been flagged and answered, we will, I think, have plenty of time to answer almost every question. I don't intend on finishing this in fewer than 10 minutes or 15 minutes. So keep asking your questions, and Arnab will keep flagging them for answers. Arnab, if we could have the next question.
I think I need to refresh my program. So let me give you the next one, and then I'll refresh it. Martina is asking if the software reads the QR code and puts it into the image file name itself when it's generated. Is that the case?
Yep. So what it actually does is, you know, we're in a raw process workflow. So what Pixelflow will do is it'll process out a quick proof JPEG. Look for the barcode in a defined area. The smaller you can make that defined area, the faster this process will be. And over long term, it makes a pretty big difference in your processing time. So it'll process.
Screen, you'd be looking at what, like the right half of the image, or like the bottom 25%? How tight do you tend to make these things?
So in this case, we started out at the bottom 25%, and then actually we moved it over to, you know, we were only looking at the left 30 or 35% of the frame, and the bottom, you know, 30% of the frame. So we actually, as we went through the project, we made that smaller and smaller so that the process would actually go faster and faster.
What's the alternative consideration? Why not just make it as small as, make it incredibly small?
So then you're going to miss, you run the risk of it not being able to find the barcode, because there's always a human error, that a human is placing that barcode in the area.
How big is, I know bees are, roughly this big, but how big are we talking about with this label? Is that 1 millimeter? Is that 1 centimeter? How big is that bee? I almost don't want to know the answer to that question. It's a really big bee.
Yeah, it's quite small, and it can vary a little bit, but those matrix barcodes are quite small, and we actually were decreasing the size of the JPEG that we were processing to read it. So it's actually, we're sampling at such a high rate that we're decreasing the JPEG that we use to read the barcode size to increase the speed as well. But to get back to your question, basically once we read that barcode in the JPEG, then that gets put into the, made as the file name for the raw file. That JPEG gets deleted, and then the derivatives get made from the raw file that it was actually renamed.
Is it a requirement the end file name be exactly the same as the barcode, or can you put it in at the beginning, put it at the end? So like this barcode seems to have the value of 01002908. Is that going to be the exact name of the file, or is that like a component in the file name?
That's a component in the file name. So you can edit that, you'll see at the top of that file name, there is or at top of that barcode, there is a USNM number. And that's actually a component of the file name too. So everything that's in that particular barcode is in the file name because they were custom made for this project. In some cases, like the picture study project, those are, a lot of times you'll find the legacy barcodes that have file names that, need to be edited. And a good example of that, Doug, is if you move forward a few frames, or actually is it forward or back, actually to the spreadsheet, you see instead of C or GCP, you have GRI. So, we actually edited the postfix and the prefix for these particular barcodes.
Very good. Arnab, if you're there, go ahead and flag a question. If you're not, then I will flag one up for us. What if the barcode represents more than one image, one barcode for a folder or manuscript material? So what experience do you have, Eric, handling barcodes that are not at an item level, or that provide something other than file name for information, for example?
So, the perfect example is what we have up on the screen. We have, 2 files that are utilizing one barcode. We are actually also doing a project for paleontology that we're utilizing barcodes, and the barcode is in every frame of maybe 4 or 5 frames because we're doing different views of the fossil. So, and each type of fossil has different views that are needed, and so you may have 2 images for that fossil, or you may have 5 images for that fossil. We need to be able to, when we're processing, be able to recognize that there are 5 images associated with that one barcode and be able to sequence them accordingly.
All right. So it looked like a question got flagged and then answered, so I'm going to go ahead and just read it out loud. Millard asks, is Pixelflow a tool that is only used by Pixel Acuity, or is it a tool available for purchase?
So right now, it is only a tool that Pixel Acuity uses because it's so heavily edited from job to job. It's not something that we can just put out there and say, this is going to work for your project, because every project's unique, and every project, quite frankly, takes a lot of time to set up Pixelflow to work for the specific needs of that project and that institution. But these are the same tools that Doug is presenting on and is in his teaching. So you can very easily, well, not easily, but I mean, you can go through and do the same thing we're doing with the resources that Doug.
Yeah, so that's to come back to the analogy we gave at the beginning. Part one, we talked about why it's so valuable to bake your own bread, right? They go into the store and buying 2-day-old bread. It's not going to be as fresh. You don't get the exact variety that you like. You can experiment. It's fresher. It's more nutritious. Like those are all sorts of reasons to buy bread, to make bread instead of buying it. And today's presentation, we're talking to Eric, who owns a bread shop and so has learned to deploy these technologies and these tools at a large scale. But in order to get his bread, you have to go to his bread shop. And I hope you don't take any offense to this, Eric. I think it'd be great for the cultural heritage community if there was more out there that was open source and that was community and collaborative based, so that every institution at their own budget, at their own capacity, would have the ability to do something like Pixelflow. Presumably they would need to name it something else. My wife is an intellectual property lawyer, so she'd come after you on trademark. But you know, maybe that's, see, I don't know, where does Millard out of? I don't know who Millard is. Maybe Smith Flow for the Smithsonian, or maybe, you know, Ohio University Flow for OU Flow, Bobcat Flow for Ohio University. So to be clear, that is not, you know, it's as we put in part one, it's not an inconsiderable amount of work to develop those tools. But if as a community, different institutions contribute to the collaborative effort that Jeremy Moore and that DT is sort of helping to back, to do these as an open source project, if you're Ohio University and you have a project very similar to Ohio State University's project, you could use their code and vice versa. And you might be making small changes and have to change it for a little bit for a particular workflow, but you know, it gets you much further than just starting from scratch on your own. So to Millard, I would ask you to attend the other 3 classes in the capstone and join the effort to build tools that do the same sorts of things that Eric does, but in an open source sense. So we can have lots of different bread shops and all have delicious bread. But right now, to be clear, Pixelflow is something you get as a result of hiring Pixel Acuity, along with, you know, your expertise and other advantages. That is one of the things you get from hiring the company. Okay, instead of barcode
real quick, sorry. So I just want to point out that there are a couple of questions about OCR, and Kurt from MoMA made an excellent point here, and I'll re-copy it in the chat here, but he said that OCR to read numbers isn't perfect, even if it's 99.9% accurate. If you image 10,000 objects and each has 10 character object numbers, you've got 100 wrong file names. Barcodes have check/error correction characters in them to make sure it was scanned correctly. So I'm going to type that back in the chat. Thank you very much, Kurt, for putting that in there. And I'll let you guys take the questions about the OCR now.
So Eric, your barcode examples so far have been using the content visually of the barcode. In the one case, it's some vertical lines, that style of barcode. I don't know the correct terminology for that, but the one axis or one directional. Here is a matrix style, which I know is what you call this XY configuration. And to some extent, it's hard to have a false positive with these kinds, because I know that with the matrix style, there's a lot of different matrix style barcodes, but one of the main reasons to go to a matrix is you can put a lot of data in there. And one of the things of data you can put in there is what would be a checksum or a validation character that says, if you've gotten through all of this and add up all the numbers, then the last digit will be, you know, 7 or something. And make it therefore that if there is a misread somewhere, it will fail instead of correct or incorrectly saying it is a specific value. So can you give us any examples or any feedback on using OCR, maybe not for barcodes, but, you know, have you used OCR for naming or categorization? And what is your experience with sort of the reliability of OCR in those contexts? Do you agree with Kurt that it's just not reliable enough to use on its own?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're going to want to use OCR for, you know, naming activities, you know, something that you need to be extremely accurate with. You know, there's levels to OCR, you know, and there's certain, you know, it's an escalating scale, you know, in terms of getting 80% accuracy, 90% accuracy. You know, the step between those two accuracy levels is pretty large. But then when you go from 90 to 95% accuracy, you know, you're adding a lot more effort into your code, into the process, and then to get to 99% accuracy, that's, you know, you're really diving into the weeds big time. So at those accuracy levels, a lot of it depends on how the type, how modern the type is, the contrast between the letters in the page or the numbers in the page. So there's so many variables that that come into play. I don't think that you're going to want to utilize OCR for, for example, file naming activities.
Very good. Arnab, next question.
A couple of questions about OCR here, so I just want to pop those up all at the same time. There's a question about software.
Okay, so what software or which engine is OCR being used in Pixelflow? So are you using Tesseract? Are you using the Google API? Are you using some Abby engine?
So Tesseract is what we're currently using. Like I said, we're exploring the Google API for even better OCR, but then incorporating identifications of people, places, and objects. That's something I'm very excited about and looking forward to working with a number of institutions.
I know that one of the times that you and I worked together on some OCR, we were finding that I think it's maybe underrated by the OCR community, just how important the quality of the input capture is and the flexibility you have in post-processing to enhance things like contrast and change white balance to be able to get better OCR results. And I think that's probably because a lot of the OCR engineers out there are working from what was prevalent 10, 15, 20 years ago, flatbed scanners, relatively low sampling efficiency, relatively low sharpness, and relatively costly to make a change like a change in contrast, whereas you're working off of the raw files as an input for this, right? So you're able to say, do this capture one operation, this capture one operation to enhance the contrast on a per image basis.
That's correct. And so that's where the editing of these scripts come into play between different projects, different institutions, because you can generally see, from project to project, what type of material you're working with and what you need to do post-production wise to make that OCR the best possible, the most.
Yeah, I think that visual literacy that you bring is got to be very helpful there. Where is the OCR being done? Can you do the OCR on images previously scanned?
So the OCR is being done at the same time as the renaming and the generation of the TIFFs and JPEGs. So your entire post-production workflow happens all at one time on that machine that's not necessarily a production machine. That allows you to really shortcut, because previously, we process out JPEGs, we set those up for OCR, and it was a multi-step process. Now we're able to do everything at one time, through Pixelflow, and it's saved a tremendous amount of time in doing it that way.
Very good. I'm going to flag up a question here. Oh, no, I just keep on pushing the wrong button, so I'm going to read the question out loud. How long does it take to process from capture, processing the derivative, reading the QR code, and renaming the file? So what sort of, can you give us an idea of end-to-end speed and how you measure better or worse in terms of?
Sure. So, the capture process, we kind of separate that from the post-production process. So, in the case like what you see on the screen now with the bees project, you'd maybe capture 900 to 1200 bees per day, and you would not be doing any processing throughout the day, including file renaming or anything along those lines. At the end of the day is when you take the raw files, the raw EIP files from the capture folder, input them into the Pixelflow folder structure, start that process, and then come back the next morning, and then you'll have finished JPEGs in a directory structure ready to deliver to the client, after QC. So the processing doesn't really come into, in that particular process, it maybe take a couple hours to process that many files, but it didn't really matter because it was happening overnight. In the case of a paleo project that we're doing, we have multiple stations that are feeding raw files into one processing machine. And sometimes that can take 10, 12, 16 hours to process a day's worth of images. So in that case, target placement, the QR code, the matrix barcode placement, and how streamlined you can make that process matters, because a lot of times you'll come in the morning and it's still not done.
Before the processing is done overnight, it's not done sort of on the go as you're capturing?
That's correct.
Is there any particular reason for that? What is the thought process of when the processing happens versus capture and timing and that sort of thing?
So when you're capturing on a machine and processing a machine at the same time, that can create slowdowns and mouse movement and bringing up the next capture, and it's just a significant amount of lag. So to be able to offload all that processing onto another machine, so that when that operator is capturing images, they're not having any impediments to their speed at which.
And you've mentioned a few times that you have many jobs where there's more than one station doing the capture work, and there'll be one computer doing the processing. Does each capture person walk over and queue up their job in the processing, or is it everybody doing capture and then somebody else does processing? How does the job delegation and supervision go?
Yeah, generally, for large projects like that, there'll be, the files will get delivered to the capture station, and then there'll be a dedicated person that will be responsible for, initial QC, processing those files through Pixelflow, and then a final QC before the files go to the client.
Yeah, so just to kind of clarify what's happening here, I see that there are some kind of like groups of questions that are around specific topics. So I'm going to pop those up in sort of the order. The next few questions are about the checksums. So I'm going to pop those up.
See if I can. So first, let's just real quick review again what a checksum is, which I think I can handle, and you can correct me if I get anything wrong. It's pretty easy if you've got, say, a 1 megapixel image that you're sending over to somebody, which would be very small, but it's just an easy number. That's 1 million sets of bytes or 1 million bytes, or honestly, the bits and bytes all get mixed up in my head, but it's 1 million of something. And it's relatively easy for you to be able to send that file to someone, and part of the file gets truncated or part of the file gets manipulated in some way, maybe as it's being uploaded or downloaded or moved from one disk to another disk. And a checksum is a way of confirming that a file has either been transferred exactly as it was or not. So a checksum is saying this file is bit for bit exactly the same as before. So the question from Martina is, does the software support any other checksum format than Md5?
So it could. But right now, I mean, like for example, we do Jove validation. We can do Jove validation just as easily. The benefit of using this coding, this Python language, is that we can incorporate different types of checksums based on the client's
needs. Basically, Md5 is what people have asked for. So you've done Md5, but if people ask for something else, I don't even know what other checksum systems there are. But I know that there's different math you can apply that's faster or slower, yes, or more advanced or less advanced, or something like that.
Sometimes it's how the checksum is formatted. Sometimes the file name is first and the checksum is next. After that, sometimes the checksum is first and the file name. Some clients can be very specific about that.
I've addressed this a little bit in the fact that you're not keeping terribly close track of how much time each operation takes, because it's always happening overnight, you said, or between shifts, that sort of thing? Okay.
Yep. So the checksums, it varies, on small files, JPEGs, it goes very, very quickly. But if you're talking about a 16-bit TIFF shot on IQ 150, it's going to take, and you do hundreds of thousands of those files, it's going to take a significant amount of time.
Next question up.
Quickly, I think you guys answered this question, so I'm just going to pop it up here. I believe you said Python, right? What coding language is Pixelflow built on?
That is So I'm going to jump up here to the beginning of our presentation. If you are interested in building tools similar to Pixelflow's, I would strongly suggest joining, in the very least, Part 4, Getting Started with Python for Digitization, and the capstone class if you have the budget and interest to go deeper. There are absolutely advantages to the other two parts. They do different kinds of things. AppleScript and Capture One SDK can do different kinds of things than Python does. But if you are looking to build tool sets similar to the ones that Eric are describing, the language that Eric you're using is Python. Yeah.
Here, I'm going to put together a couple of questions that we have on what types of computer you use and sort of why you split it between multiple computers. So let me find.
And we'll throw out a quick admonition here that it is coming up on 50 minutes. I think we'll probably cut this at the 1 hour mark, which is not to say that, Eric, you wouldn't be able to still communicate with people if they have questions for you. Eric, how would they reach you after this presentation?
They can reach me at EAP, Eric Anthony Philcox, at pixelacuity.com.
Great. So then we'll still do 10 more minutes of questions, but if we run out of time at that point, you'll need to reach Eric directly. Go ahead, Arnab.
As I guess let me just kind of give you the long and short of a lot of these questions is, you know, what kind of computer do you need to sort of run these things when you're doing the QC and the checksums? And if you're doing them overnight, you know, why do you need a separate computer? And also, have you ever thought about offloading it to a cloud computing sort of
That is an excellent trifecta of questions. So what kind of computer do you use? Have you considered doing it online or via a server mentality as opposed to connected directly? And why a separate computer in the first place?
So generally the computer that we use for the post-production Pixelflow is a little bit higher end computer than in terms of speed, processing power than we need for the capture stations. You know, generally that computer has an SSD, you know, it has all the RAM we can fit into it, and you know, has a very high processing power. That's not always required for, you know, each capture station. So some of it is budget related, but you definitely want, you know, I think the SSD probably makes and the processor probably make the biggest difference in how long this takes. And like I said, you know, when we're dealing with thousands and thousands of files, you know, sometimes it can take, you know, 10, 16 hours. We're kind of excited about the new Mac Pro that came out, and being able to leverage that on some of these larger projects. You know, for, you know, the reason between sending it to one station is, quite frankly, the process might not be done by the next morning. And, you know, there is a certain amount of QC that goes into before we put it through the post-production process. And if we can centralize that, have someone dedicated to doing the QC and then processing, it takes that burden off of the individual shooters, and they can focus on shooting. In terms of the cloud, it sounds like a great idea, and being able to leverage that, you know, cloud processing power. However, with the files that we are shooting, you know, generally 100 megapixel files, soon be 150 megapixel files, that upload time would be restrictive.
Well, that makes sense. Arnab, you have another grouping of questions. We have another 5 minutes.
Yes, so the next series of questions is about the QC process. So there are a couple of questions. So the first is a couple about the speed. So how long does it take the result, you know, to get the QC results? So I popped that one up there.
How long does it take to?
So you're saying that Pixelflow can do some initial QC, and let me just advance to that slide. You know,
Yep.
What speed of QC and at what stage, and you know, I think one thing we'll just say very quickly, especially for anybody who's not listening with native English, QC here, we mean quality control, and that's checking various parts of the process to make sure that, for example, you captured everything you're supposed to capture, and that you captured it correctly, and that the captured images all got processed, and the processed images all look correct, and the naming is all correct, and the folders are all correct. And I mean, there's a lot of things you're QCing. So what does Pixelflow QC and what doesn't it QC, and how fast can it do the things that it's doing?
So we've broken it up, Pixelflow, into a couple different modules. For the example we showed with the inline target and the missed crop, that's what we call a pre-flight. So that's actually done prior to the processing starting, the processing part of Pixelflow starting. So in this particular case, it's going to color tag the files that it thinks might have a problem. All of that gets reviewed before you kick off the main part of processing, derivative creation, OCR, and things of that nature. So we've kind of broken it down into two, the QC process into a couple different parts. In the case of, like, say, the bees, and when we were, we're looking for a barcode to be to use in the file name. If that barcode was out of the frame that it was looking for, out of the region that the software is looking for, you're going to have files at the end of the process that didn't go all the way through. Those will be very apparent in the reporting that is done at the end of the processing, and then the operator can go look at that file and say that they need to increase the window of the that the software is looking for the barcode in. They can do it just for that one particular file in the configuration.
How does the QC process usually change when using Pixelflow? Do you sample formally, and at what points in the process do you get human eyeballs in the project? So again, definitionally, especially if anybody's not listening in native English, when we say sample, that is, I'm taking that to mean statistically sampling, meaning checking 1 out of 2 or 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000. That's what sampling would mean, as opposed to doing 100% QC. So can you tell us a little bit about how automation and Pixelflow are changing how often you QC and at what points human eyes are used? I'll say this, I really enjoyed in your presentation talking about the fact that you still emphasize to people that just because the computer is going to help them QC, they're still personally responsible, I think is what you said, which I think is, you can't allow a person to take and use a computer as an excuse for a bad product.
Right. So what generally happens is this process doesn't necessarily change the rate at what we sample for QC. It's more of a scale as we go through a project where you're doing a higher percentage towards the beginning of a project, usually very high. As you go along and you minimize or eliminate the errors that you're finding, that percentage gets rolled back. And then if within that percentage sampling, if you do start to find more errors than you should be, then it gets escalated to a higher degree of QC. So I wouldn't say that this changes that in a sense. It maybe just changes what you're looking for. But the QC process starts at capture. So the technician has a series of QC that he does while they're, which would be the pre-flight. Running that pre-flight for checking for crops and things of that nature, sometimes as automated, sometimes as manual. Then there's another step, before everything, if there's a QC manager, in the case of some of our projects that we do, that they're looking for things before they kick off the process. And then after, we get a report from Pixelflow saying, if anything failed, why it failed, and then some things that weren't being able to be processed. So that all, it's a multi-stage process, and it doesn't change the sampling at the end that we do, before final delivery.
I was going to advise that we only have time for, let's say,
presentation, Doug. There are just a couple of questions that I want to make sure I get to you. Rapid fire, 30 seconds. Do the DT Apple?
Hey, Eric, put your driving gloves on. We're going fast.
So this is for Doug. Does the DT Apple script accomplish some of these tasks that they outlined?
So first and foremost, I would advise you to carefully read the page, the link that is on the AppleScript building blocks. AppleScript building blocks are intended as tools for learning and to give you code from which you can make your own code. I would not advise people to buy it because you think one of the scripts will solve one of your specific problems. I would advise you to buy it because you're interested in those kinds of problems and you would want code to help you get started to make your own solutions to those problems. In the case of, for example, reconciling manifests, naming, and QC, yes, some of those would be in the building blocks. In terms of OCR, PDF compilation are not. Md5 Checksum would not be. So some yes, some no. Check out that page thoroughly. And if you have any questions, you can always ask us before you pull the trigger on buying one.
Great. And then last one here, is there a Pixelflow demo online? And if not, what should people do, Eric, if they want to talk to you more about learning some more about it?
Sure. So there, it's a fairly new program for us that we're using. We've been partnered with Digital Transitions for just about a half a year now. So we're still in quite a bit of development for it. So there's no real demo per se, but that is a great idea. If you want to talk to me more about it, feel free to reach me at EAP at.
If people want to see the Pixelflow, Eric.
I know. We gotta put that together.
All right.
Got to demo.
Arnav, was there still one or two that you needed to get through?
Yeah,
or
that was, I think, all we have time for. But I'm putting, if you guys would both just put your email address and contact information in the chat so people have it, that would be great. And we'll send it out in the follow-up email if we can as well.
That's my email address. First and foremost, before we go, I want to say that we at DT, and I'm sure I can speak for Eric at Pixelflow, are hopeful that you guys are all staying sane and safe. I know it's a challenging time for a lot of people, and we are thinking of all those who are facing challenges greater than we are. Thank you so much for joining. Do remember that we have parts 3, 4, and 5 coming up. Those, I believe, are either already on the website or will be on the website in the next few days. And stay tuned to email for additional follow-up on dates and times for those things. There we go. I finally got the right slide on the screen. 3, 4, and 5 in the capstone class. Thanks you all. Kate, this ends the formal presentation. Please end the webinar.